Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Boccia England's fourth and final Boccia Development Advisory webinar of this recent series that we've done. Hope you're well and staying safe. I'm Kate, and I'm pleased to welcome you this evening to our Boccia Development Advisory webinar supporting club income generation. Firstly, just a few housekeeping points. If you can keep your mic muted and camera off during the presentations, and then after the presentations, you'll be able to turn on your cameras again and invited to unmic yourself if you'd like to ask a question. If you'd like to do so, please use the chat function below to introduce yourself. And if you require any support throughout the webinar, if you just drop George a message in the chat box and he'll be able to try and support you with that. And just to let you know finally that this webinar is being recorded so we can make it available to watch back on our YouTube channel as well. So that will be available in a few days' time. So to tonight's webinar, I'm delighted that tonight we're joined by Callie Keatley, who is our Boccia England's fundraising manager, and Niall Judge, who is Sport England's club development manager. Over the next hour, Callie and Niall will be talking to you about the various methods that your Boccia club can use to generate income. They'll also be able to answer questions that you might have about club income generation at the end of the webinar. So if you do have a question, as I said, just pop it in the chat box and we'll go through those later. So I'm not going to delay it anymore. I'll pass you over to Callie, who will talk to you about club fundraising.
Thanks. So, hi, I'm Callie. I'm the fundraising manager at Boccia England, and my primary responsibility is raising funds for Boccia England as a charity. But I also have responsibility for providing support and advice to clubs for fundraising. So tonight, I'm just going to talk through a few of the options that you've got when looking for funding for your club. So George, if you could go on to the next slide. Thank you. So firstly, we're going to have a look at applying for grants. So there are literally thousands of grant giving bodies in the UK, from large multi-million-pound or national organisations to smaller family-run foundations, and each of these have got their own areas of interest. And it can feel a bit overwhelming, so it's important to think up front about what it is that you actually need funding for. So is it equipment, venue hire, kit, transport, or might it be a specific event or project that you want to run? So this means that you can search for funders that actually fund what it is you're looking for, and you can narrow it down quite quickly. So there's some key places it's worth looking at initially. So Sport England's the obvious one, but I'll skip over that as Niall will be talking about it in a lot more detail later on. Local community foundations are a useful place to look. So this is the website from the Nottinghamshire one that I've pulled up as my local one. So these are community foundations are essentially brokers between people and organisations that want to give their money locally, and then the local charities and groups that are looking for funding. So they often have lists of open grant opportunities on their website, but it's also useful to just get in touch with them, introduce yourselves, let them know what it is that you do, so that when they're talking to funders, they'll have you in their minds. Similarly, your local active partnership as well. So their website will have a list of trusts and foundations that you can apply to. They have news with new funders that are coming out all the time. They also have advice and tips on applying for funds, and some of them do even offer bid writing services. And then finally, I've just included on here the National Lottery Community Funds Award for All programme, which gives grants of up to £10,000. So whilst there are lots of really fantastic sports funders out there, and they'll often be your first port of call, it is important to think about the other aspects of what you do and what might resonate with funders. So there are obviously funders specifically interested in activities that benefit disabled people, funders that are looking to improve mental health and combat social isolation, for example. So just kind of a note to say, you don't always have to go down the traditional sport route, and there are other places you can look as well. So next slide, please, George. So I've just put some top tips down here. These are some of the key things that kind of I think through when I'm doing applications for Boccia England, and it would be useful for you to kind of think through if you're thinking of applying for a grant. So the first one, and it sounds obvious, is check your eligibility. So some funders, for example, will only fund registered charities, and your club might or might not be one of those. Whereas others, like the Lotteries Awards for All, fund community groups too. So make sure you check that first so you don't waste any time. Geographic restrictions are also an important eligibility criteria, so make sure the funding that you're going for applies to the area that your club's in. And also just a note at the moment, so obviously some funders are in COVID response mode still, so just because you were perhaps eligible for a fund before doesn't mean you might be at the moment, so again, it's just worth checking. Nextly, I've put have a conversation, because it's really important, if you can, to talk to the person at the grant giving organisation if you can. So this could be a grant officer or the trust administrator. It's not always possible to do this, but if you can, it's really useful to start to build a relationship. And next, and again, some of these seem obvious, but read the guidance. So look at what it is they fund. So not just the cause, but actually the type of activity. So some funders will only fund what they call capital costs, which are things like buildings or equipment, rather than things like events. And look at the application format. So if they have an application form, it's fairly straightforward and you know what they're asking for. But if they're just asking for a written submission, then perhaps, again, it's probably worth getting in touch with them to find out, you know, there's no point you writing 10 pages if they only want one, for example. And then tailor your application. So again, look at what the funder's interested in, and tailor your application accordingly. So as I mentioned before, perhaps the funder is particularly interested in improving mental health. So if that is the case, make sure that you put some focus on that and highlight the positive impact your work has in that area, perhaps with some quotes or case studies from your members. And then the next 2 points kind of go together. So don't assume knowledge of boccia. A lot of people are, unfortunately and sadly, haven't heard of the sport, but a couple of sentences to explain it and what's unique about it is enough. You don't need to go into too much detail. Don't waffle. Be clear about what the money is going to be spent on, who it will benefit, and the impact that it will have. And if you can, you know, include numbers and think specific things about the needs of your players and your club. And finally, get someone to read it through before you submit it. That's always worth doing. It doesn't have to be someone associated to your club. It could be a friend or family member, but just somebody to sort of proofread and have a second look. And this isn't a tip for applying as such, but it is important to note any reporting requirements if you're successful in getting funding. So even if they don't state that they require a report from you, it's good practice to send a brief report sort of 6 to 12 months after you receive the funding, unless they've specifically asked you not to. And this will put you in much better stead if you want to go back and apply for funds again in the future. And finally, sort of depending on the relationship, and you'll know kind of how it's gone, it might be appropriate to invite them along once we're back to training, to invite them along to a training session to meet your players and just see what it's all about, really. So next slide, please, George. So this is support from companies, largely companies, but also other local organisations. So local companies can be really great advocates for you. So not only might they sponsor your club, but they can also be really good at raising awareness in your local area if you're looking for new players, new volunteers, anything like that. So the top tip I would say is think about who you know. So it's much easier to get in there if you know someone. So companies that your players or your players' families or your volunteers might work for. Small local companies are often looking for organisations to support. And it can be easier to get in touch with them if you do have a personal connection. But then lots of larger companies have corporate social responsibility schemes. So employees can often nominate charities for grants to their employers. So again, it's worth finding out where your volunteers and the parents of your players and your players work, and seeing if any of those companies have those schemes. But it doesn't have to be large corporations, and support can come in lots of different ways. And other organisations that aren't corporates might also be interested in supporting you. So an example here, this T-shirt that we've got with it says Solent University on it. So Solent Boccia Club, I think Peter's here tonight, they've developed a great relationship with the Saints Disabled Supporters Association. So this is the organisation for disabled supporters of Southampton Football Club. and they raise funds through things like bucket collections. They have an open day each year, and then they give a proportion of what they raise to local disability sport organisations. And I know that they've pledged £500 a year for 2 years to Solent Boccia for team kit and other equipment. And again, it's kind of starting to build those relationships and then going along to their open days, you know, demonstrating Boccia to other people who might not have heard about it. All has that added value. I've got another example here from Georgina at Gem Boccia. So this is a company that donated some tins of chocolates to the club, and they were able to repackage them and sell those to raise funds as well. So it's not always directly giving money, but it might be gifts in kind or other services. And I've also included here the Sheffield Smashers logo, because this is a club that's run by a company, Irwin Mitchell, who run a few boccia clubs around the country. And just is a great example of a company that's really dedicated to grassroots boccia. And when you're looking for companies or organisations to support you, have a think about what you can offer them. So obviously, you can see on the t-shirt here, logos on things is a great way to do that, but also things that don't cost anything, like thanks on social media. It shows them that they're appreciated and it will help them with their reputation, but it also reinforces your message to other companies and other organisations that you are a club in need of support. And also boccia clubs have, you know, a brilliant opportunity to offer things like volunteering opportunities and taster sessions for boccia. And often volunteering is a good first step if, you know, you're looking for funding in the future. A lot of companies are looking for places where their employees can volunteer too. So next slide, please, George. So another place you could look is all the major supermarkets have some kind of local giving scheme, and there are boccia clubs all over the country that have already benefited from this. The beauty of these schemes is that pretty much all of them are open to community groups, so you don't need to be a registered charity to apply. I'll just run through them quite quickly, but of course more information is available on the website for each of the supermarkets. So Asda, you can see here that the Thanet Thunderers Boccia Club received £500, and that was through their Green Token scheme, which is suspended at the moment because of COVID, but when we get back to normal, that will be kind of restarted again. But they also run a programme called Transforming Communities and Improving Lives. And that, although that's paused at the moment due to COVID, it's actually a really good fit for boccia clubs, because they have a category within that called Active Lives, and that funds kit and equipment for sports clubs, particularly with a community focus. Waitrose Community Matters, so you can fill in a form in store or write to your branch, and each month £1,000 is divided between 3 local charities from each branch of Waitrose. And again, I know that Gem Boccia Club have benefited from that in the past. Tesco Bags of Help, so this is an application process that you can do through the website, and again they'll fund sports equipment if it's for community benefit. But also there's a Tesco customer nomination form. So again, talk to your players, your volunteers, anybody who is a customer of Tesco's can put in a nomination for a local organisation that they think should receive some support. The Co-op Local Community Fund is closed to applications at the moment, but that should open again in the spring. And that is for customers who are members of the Co-op. A percentage of what they spend in store goes to their preferred local cause. Again, it's a really good one to express an interest in. I've included the Morrison's Foundation on here, but that is one that is a little bit more for, well, it's only for registered charities, and they are very large grants. So it might, if you're wanting to do something really big, it might definitely be one to look at, but like I say, it is only open to registered charities. And finally, I've included, and apologies, I'm not sure if it's NISA or NISA, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but smaller supermarkets. So these are sort of corner shops generally, and they're independently owned, but it's a franchise. And they have a charity called Make a Difference Locally, which enables the managers of each of the independent stores to nominate local organisations to receive funding. And I've included this in there because Scar Boccia up in Scarborough received an amazing £5,000 award through this programme. So yeah, it really is worth looking into all these things. And finally, just to say that post-COVID, you know, other things in supermarkets such as bucket collections and things like that are also options. So it's worth contacting the community champion or community officer at your local stores. Thanks, George. Next slide, please. And finally, again, most of these things probably seem a long way off at the moment, but it's worth starting to think about when the world opens up again. Looking at things like Boccia open days and festivals. And again, I think Boccia Club do a regular bingo night, or had done pre-COVID. And also going to, not just running things where you are, but also going out and running Boccia activities at things like local fetes or local events. So just that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I'm aware, but I just kind of want to finish on the message that awareness is really key for local support. So if you're at the last webinar that we ran a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that we've now got a club media guide, which will be available on our website soon. But I think beyond the kind of media and social media and things, I think it's just, and again, I appreciate this is difficult at the moment, but it's thinking about getting out there and networking, and using the connections of those people that are involved in your club. And don't be afraid to ask. So local people and local businesses often want to support local causes, but unless they know who you are and what you do, you know, they won't be able to support you. So yeah, get out there and ask and put the message out there. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Callie. Hi, everybody. Just introduce myself. So my name's Niall Judge. I'm development manager for clubs at Sport England. Been here for a good couple of years now, and in a previous life, I worked for an active partnership. So one of the partners that Callie mentioned in terms of local support. So quite familiar in terms of the national and local side of bits and pieces. What I will do is kind of build on Callie's presentation there and kind of give a bit of an insight into initially just kind of funding and diagnosing your kind of funding need. And then I'll go into a bit of learnings from grant funding, and a bit of focus on the current availability of funding from Sport England. Thanks, George. This is like a daily briefing. I love it. So just in terms of the funding need, and Callie kind of was talking about this in terms of applying for grants. And the thing we always encourage applicants and other clubs to very much start with is kind of, where's your funding need come from? So is this something that you've decided to do because a piece of funding has become available and therefore you're applying because you feel that you fit to it? Or is it something that actually this is something you've thought about for a while, and that might be reaching out to new people, it might be buying some new equipment, it might be using some different facilities or accessing more facilities? So what we always trying to encourage is try not to let funding be a gut reaction. We know there'll be certainly times where that needs to be the case for an emergency, for an opportunity that's kind of come up, but try and plan in advance. Actually, we might look for some funding at some point, or we might need to think about in the future, we'd like to run some programs, or we'd like to reach out to people in the second half of the year. So it becomes a bit of a planned process. And then once you decide to go to funding, it really is develop a plan. And my biggest thing on this is get other people around. It was really good when Callie was kind of talking about getting a second opinion. I actually think it's great to have people around you, even if they've never applied for funding before, who can help you. So it might be looking at some website for funders. It might be starting to think about actually what's our story? What do we need to tell people? Those kind of couple of sentences that Callie talks about is great. Actually, you know, could you all sit down together and just think, well, what's our reason to be as a club, and starting to do that, and then starting to get a plan to go, okay, well, this is when we want to have the application written by. So this is when we need to think maybe to have a first draft. Do I need to have a conversation with the funder? So do I need to email them? Do I need to pick up the phone and have a conversation? If you try to do that all at the start and kind of work backwards from the deadline, then that gives you a really good basis for how you want to do stuff. Because if possible, you really don't want to have to rush what you're trying to do. Then I've got in there in terms of, and this really kind of comes with it, is understanding the best option for you. And I'm not going to go into the other options, lots of the funding you can do that Callie's just kind of talked about. But, you know, one avenue is grant funding. that Sport England do give out, but there are lots of other things. And sometimes it's fair to say grant funding might not be the right thing for your organisation. It might be those community foundations. It might be raising money through collections or different things. So when we say about make sure it's the right funding for you, it's to know, well, if there's a requirement with that funding to give figures, if there's a requirement to do lots of different bits and things, if that doesn't really work for you, then actually don't put yourself in that kind of situation. And equally, there's lots of places at the moment that are doing loans instead of grants. So actually, is a loan the right kind of thing for you? It may not well be, it might be the right opportunity, but certainly there's a lot of those around at the moment, and certainly there is some concern in terms of actually how accessible are they going to always be. The next point is kind of, it should seem straightforward, but make sure you're eligible. I think it's one of the biggest things we see when people come in for funding. They don't read the eligibility criteria and just kind of coming for funding because they want to come in for funding. So just make sure you're eligible and that you're ticking, the boxes that need to be. And if you're not sure, reach out to those funders. You can reach out to us in terms of from Sport England. You can drop us an email on our funding email address, or you can ring our funding line and just ask the question. It's always better to ask than to put it in and then potentially, get rejected because they're like, no, you've not hit the eligibility criteria. And then the other bit in there is longer term financial planning. So it sounds really, it's a very, I don't quite know why I put it like that, but actually what are some of the lessons you learned from this? So whether you're successful, whether you hit your fundraising target, or whether it doesn't quite get to where you want to go, what have we learned from this that actually we could avoid doing in the past, and actually what then can we plan for in the future? So if it's not quite worked, it might be, well, let's learn for this, and then in 3 months' time, let's maybe have another look at fundraising for this again, or thinking about doing things. So always try and learn those lessons for kind of what we're doing. And I'll come back to that last bit in terms of don't be afraid to ask for help in a moment. Thanks, George. So just onto our funding schemes. So Sport England's funding schemes, and this is, I know this is going on YouTube, so as of March 2021, we've got 3 funding schemes at the moment. There is a 4th, which I'll touch on briefly in a moment. But our current funding schemes are there. So if you just move forward one, George, I'll start to talk about the 2 return to play ones to start with. So we've got 2 funds at the moment: return to play small grants and return to play the community asset fund. And these are really both in response to the coronavirus pandemic, have both been adapted from our previous small grants. And they're really to try and help people to get back to activity who have been disproportionately affected, particularly around physical activity, but in broader things as well. So the small grants one, which is probably the most applicable to most of the clubs here, is applying for up between £300 to £10,000. And it's where it is going to provide support for essential changes to services or facility to help people return to activity. So, for example, if you've got an additional bill for buying more hygiene stuff, if you're now going to have more facility time because actually you're going to keep the social distancing in place, which means less people can play in one time, or whether you need kind of additional equipment then to help more people be active at the same time. It really is designed for those things to help people to be back to activity. Now, I'm very aware that currently lockdown measures are in place, and they're in place obviously until the end of this month. So what we say with with this particular fund is that you can apply now. And as long as activity begins within 6 weeks of kind of national restrictions changes, then that's absolutely fine. So, for example, you could start working on this now. The fund is open at the moment until the 30th of June 2021. And we're going to constantly review how long we keep this funding open. We know that the return to play may take longer. And certainly if any of the government restrictions kind of carry on a little bit further, then we will continue to review that. And in terms of who we're looking to fund, so our priorities are projects that are located in areas of high deprivation, and that's areas 1 to 5 of IMD. And you can go on our website and search if your club is in one of those areas, or alternatively, and if you are organisations that are working with populations that have been disproportionately affected, so that have been affected through coronavirus, therefore are much less likely to be active. And you can see there's a list there that you can kind of revisit as well. So that's kind of the Return to Play Small Grants Fund. The Community Asset Fund is perhaps more for capital development, so where there's need to be a real adaptation of spaces. I'm not entirely sure how much this will completely reign true with you guys, but it might be facilities that you operate in that really need some help. So it could be community centres that need this support. This wouldn't be applicable to leisure centres though. So if you do operate in a leisure centre, that wouldn't be right. This would be something that where capital fund is needed to adapt the space in response to COVID. So again, it's things potentially to allow greater social distancing, to allow more chances for hygiene and cleaning in different things, but it could be physical changes to the spaces that need to happen. And again, the priorities are exactly the same as the Return to Play small grants. Okay. Now, if neither of these funding streams work for you, or if they're not quite right, then we do have another one. So if you jump forward again for us, please, George. Thank you very much. So if you don't feel you fall into those priorities, or actually if you think actually that's not quite for us, it doesn't quite hit, then we've got Active Together, which is our crowdfunding, which is our work with Crowdfunder as an organisation, but it's a crowdfunding scheme. And some of you might have come across crowdfunding. And the principle is with our Crowdfunder is that you can apply to they say that you're going to raise a certain amount of money, and then Sport England will match fund that up to £10,000. This has been really, really popular over the last couple of months, but there is still money in the pot and there is still things available for this. And the kind of the criteria for this is a little bit broader as well. But crucially, it doesn't mean that clubs have to say we're going to raise 10,000. It might say actually we only need to raise £2,000, and therefore that may be more achievable for any clubs to kind of look into that, and then we can match fund it. So again, that could be for equipment, that could be facilities, it could be for a bit broader as well in terms of coaching costs or travel to help people kind of get to sessions as well. And the reason that kind of we've certainly moved a lot more into crowdfunding is it is really popular, but it's popular because it gives it more of a sense of ownership with the funding. So whilst with grant funding, it's a one hit and there we go. Sometimes what we're finding with crowdfunding is actually it builds a greater community around it, and it gives added value to the club and group. So there's a greater awareness. There's a good chance that you'll attract more members just by having a campaign and just having the name out there. So the actual power of crowdfunder is slightly different to grant funding, and it can really give you those great connections as to what you're doing. The link I've popped on the bottom there is a link to our the crowdfunder page around Active Together. There's a couple of really great case studies of clubs, variety of different clubs that have gone through the process. You can also see ones that are live at the moment, so you can see what type of things people are fundraising for. And also you'll find that we run monthly workshops with Crowdfunder, which you can do. They're absolutely free. They're all online, and you can just go on and listen to see whether Crowdfunder is the right option for you as to where you're going to go. There are other crowdfunding platforms that do exist, which you can feel free to look into. I would encourage you just to pop onto our website and look at crowdfunding, because we also do have some kind of top tips for crowdfunding as well, how to build a good campaign and things like that. Thanks, George. Now, I'm not going to read through this slide because this is one for after that you can kind of get hold of and have a really good look into. But these are just some common questions when applying for grant funding. Some common things that it would be good to kind of ask yourselves and to check and challenge. So this is very much a tool for after. But often these are the questions that funders and particularly we will ask. Obviously, we don't ask all of this in huge depth. We're we've got a much more high level questions these days. So very, 200 words, tell us what you want to do, for example. But what these kind of prompts I'm hoping will be useful to do is when you're sitting down with that group to plan, and when you're thinking about, you can kind of ask yourself some of these questions to think, well, what are we trying to do? So for example, when it's the need, I like some of the questions in here. It's kind of, what's the need for your idea? What issues are going to address? Have you done any kind of research to kind of find out why this is what you need to do? And I always like to think about it. I like Callie's idea, the 2 sentences kind of idea, but mine's the old elevator pitch. Can you tell us in 30 seconds what the need is and what you're trying to do? If you can do that, there's a good chance that that's the kind of the key thing that a funder needs to know. Funders are very different. Some will require a lot more information than others. And again, that's just part of the planning and part of the working with other people to kind of help in with that as well. The last bit is just that bit at the bottom there, sorry, with additional information. So this is always part of that planning phase, is just to make sure you've got things up to date. So if you've got things like a business plan, if you've got things like your policies, your safeguarding policies and things like that, it's a good opportunity just to make sure all of that is up to date, because some funders will ask to see certain bits of pieces. And again, if you need support around that, Boccia England are there to support, but also you can come to Club Matters, who we work with, Boccia England, who have that support around kind of policies, procedures, and the like as well. Thank you, George. So the last thing from me, so you can go and get your dinners, although questions first, of course, is just where to go to get that further funding advice. So obviously there's Boccia England, who are there to help. There's active partnerships. So there are those who have probably come across them, but there are 42 active partnerships across the country. Generally, they're in every county, and you can Google your active partnership for your local county. But what they have is a really good insight into those local opportunities. So all of those thousands of opportunities that Callie talked about earlier, they should know what are the local opportunities that are are available and what could be right for you. And they may also be able to give you kind of a one-to-one advice. You can give them a call, you can ask, you drop them an email, and generally they're there to kind of support as well for you to access funding. At the moment, we are currently working with active partnerships around tackling inequality funding. And this is, again, small grants to organizations where they're tackling inequality in a very localized thing. So this is funding that's being distributed by active partnerships. And you can kind of pop onto their websites and have a look at what those is. The reason I've not put loads of information is because 42 have all got it very, very slightly differently, but it may well be that you fit their kind of criteria. Again, it's about people who have been disproportionately affected by COVID, therefore are much more likely to be inactive at this phase. So it's how can they be supported to get back into activity. It's been a really, really big success. Tackling inequality has gone down really, really well. And again, it can just be small amounts of funding to help people what it can do. And you'll find there's potentially a little bit more flexibility with some of the work that they're doing as well. So they're a really good asset for you to use. Sport England website, there's loads of case studies and guidance on there. You can also do a little bit of diagnosis. We've got a diagnosis tool as well to see if you fit the funding criteria, which is a useful thing to do. And then just a bit of a nod to what Callie was talking about earlier in terms of there's lots of voluntary and community organisations. So for example, I live in Gloucestershire and there's the Gloucestershire Voluntary Community Sector Organisation who often give advice around funding and how to access lots of different bits and pieces. So there are lots of advice at a local level. If you just put your VCS and your county in, generally that's a good place to start. Or as Callie kind of said, your community foundation. The last bit is just a bit of a nod to Club Matters and Club Matters workshops, which are free to attend. Boccia occasionally will run those, but we do have open ones that you can attend across the country. Sorry, they are virtual at the moment, of course. One of them is around financial sustainability, which is a bit more around financial planning, but we've also got a range of other topics, things like engaging your community. So how do you work with different communities? Participant experience, volunteer experience workshops. These are free 2-hour online workshops that just kind of put you in a room with other clubs and give you a chance to kind of learn a little bit, share some stories, share some experiences, and really just give some prompts around those topics. So you can access those via that link that's there, but it's on the Club Matters website. So that's it from me. Again, a bit of a whirlwind tour through anything. So yes, that's it. Thank you. Oh, I have a question.
Thanks, Niall, and thanks, Callie. That was a really great presentation. There's a really insightful information there. now it's helpful for any questions how attendees may have. I think I can see one has just come in the chat box, and it's from Jenny right there. Is there a set time to raise your target amount if you access the crowdfunding scheme?
Yeah. Hi, Jenny. Nice to see you. I used to work with Jenny at Active Gloucestershire. So there's I said about that earlier. So is there a set timescale? What I'm going to say no as such. So what Crowdfunder will do with work with you is to understand the right amount of time. So it could take 50 days. It could take 2 months. It could take a week. It's kind of what's going to be the right thing to you. Certainly, if you're going for the big, £9,000-10,000, it probably is going to take a little bit of time because you're going to want to do fundraising things to all contribute to that big pot. But typically, it's kind of what's going to feel right to you. If you go on if you go to the Crowdfunder site, you'll see there's lots of different projects that some say 23 days left and they've got 20% left to do, and bits and pieces like that. So it's kind of what is the right amount of time for you. I think there is a cap. I think generally if it's going on past several months, that's probably not going to be right. But yeah, it's kind of what will feel right for the amount of funding you're coming in for.
Thanks, Noel. Does anybody else have any questions? Either feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat box now.
Can I just jump in and ask one? Just to Niall and Callie, really, how has the last year changed the ability to be able to access funding for sports clubs? And do you see, as the picture hopefully improves, do you see that changing again?
Do you want to go first, Callie? Oh, I think you're on mute, Callie.
Hang on, is that better?
Yeah.
From Boccia England's perspective, and from kind of what we've seen, I think there has been a tendency for a lot of funders to switch to COVID response mode this year, which has meant that there are some funds that we previously might have been able to access, and we haven't during the kind of last 12 months. Because funding's been diverted, quite understandably, to frontline charities, places like food banks and things like that. But I think now there is a shift to, and as you've sort of seen through Niall's examples, kind of post-COVID recovery type activity. So there are funds now that are kind of opening up to things where actually I think boccia clubs have got a real opportunity, because it's about starting to kind of get people active again after quite a long period of inactivity, and the kind of mental health and mental well-being side of that as well, because again, people have been isolated for a long time, and actually being able to kind of express the benefits that getting back to your boccia club, when it's safe and when people feel comfortable to do so, is going to have, is actually a real selling point for some of the funding that kind of is available for that post-COVID recovery.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think the one thing COVID has shone the spotlight on is physical activity and absolute the benefits of it. And I think for us, the great thing is that physical activity the spotlight has been shone on it, the power of it. It's great to see. It's one of the things you can do throughout lockdown, if you're able to. But that's the kind of thing we need to see kind of continued and keep that increased spotlight. That the anger that went around when young people couldn't play sport anymore, couldn't do things outside, was quite profound. And so actually there's the value really shining through, and there's lots of different things that are going to come through. So what we're very hopeful for is that the opportunities for funding will be there, because there is increased kind of sight around physical activity, but equally as around kind of community development. I think that the power of volunteers, the power of clubs and community groups has really shone through in throughout COVID, and actually the value has been heightened even more than we already knew it was. So the opportunities are there, the community connection is there. I don't want to say about leveling up, because that's a very government way of saying things, but certainly there's a need to, to keep going. So I think there will be opportunities going forward. I think there is inherently going to be some challenges, because the amount of money available may decrease in a variety of places. But we just don't know that at the moment. So we've got to be optimistic that there's more on the horizon that can really help with this. And certainly from our perspective, I've said it a few times that physical activity inequalities have been really shown up through COVID. So we've got to really work hard to initially get back to where we were. And that's going to take some time and some effort to do that. But then to keep growing and to keep moving, that's really key.
Super, thank you both.
I was just in the chat box that Carter had also had another avenue to explore in our local council sports department, and he has said how her club got a donation from their council sports department 7 years ago, and that's how their club started.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. There is sometimes some funding within local authorities that can really help. I know that certainly where I used to work in Gloucestershire, there was access to funding to support things in a local authority. So yeah, real opportunities. If you do have contacts into local authorities, that's grand. If not, like I said, have a chat to your active partnership who should know what local authority opportunities are for funding as well. But yeah, there are definitely some that do still have some community grants and community pots available.
That's great. Do you have any final few questions that you want to ask Niall or Kelly?
Been let off easily, I'd say. Well, I think you might have answered lots of questions with the presentations. I think there was loads of really good practical advice there for people to kind of take away and digest. And both Callie and Niall said about the support through either Boccia England, Sport England and other organisations as well is there. So if you go away and re-watch this or have a look at through the slides and get back in touch if there is anything, please do. So thank you everybody for your time. It brings us to the end of this evening's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you to Callie and Niall for your great presentations in terms of all the practical advice and information that you provided. And thank you to George as well, who's been technical support tonight and coordinating the questions, but also really helping to coordinate the whole series of webinars that we've hosted over the last few weeks. So thank you, George. Hope you've all enjoyed this evening and the other development webinars that we've held recently to support clubs and members. We are planning to be back later on in the year to do a back to Boccia session to talk through how we can support you to get back on the court, and that will be dependent on the timescales for return. So keep your eyes peeled on our website and we'll send out more information when we get it. Until then, please stay safe. Look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you and take care.